Great. So we have quite a full agenda this afternoon. We're going to be hearing from a number of speakers from NREL as well as other guests who have joined. I see some old familiar names, members of the African Minigrids community of practice, but also partners who we've collaborated with in the past. It's very good to see you. It's good to catch up as we end this year. My part is quite straightforward and simple. It is just to welcome you, but also to welcome you on behalf of the Africa-led Partnership Secretariat based here in Cape Town, South Africa. My name is Josh Ogada, and I've got a couple of colleagues, Roy Bauer and Sihle Matiwane, who are joining us also from the Secretariat. For those of you, I'm sure most of you are already aware of the work of the LEDS Global Partnership, but for those of you who are not aware of the LEDS Global Partnership, the LEDS Global Partnership was launched in 2011 and has since become a vibrant platform for peer learning and collaboration. And the work of the LEDS Global Partnership focuses on peer learning, technical collaboration, and exchange. But we also does a lot of work in the area of implementation of ambitious low emissions development strategies and NDCs. The LEDS GP also focuses on country and demand-driven work to help build capacity of practitioners within different countries. And all of this work is undertaken through the 4 regional platforms, the Africa platform, the Asia platform, and 3 platforms, and the Latin American and Caribbean platform. So we as the Africa-led Partnership work very closely with the Global Secretariat as well as with our co-regional partnerships to work under the action areas of energy, of transport, AFOLU, as well as finance. And within the different regions, we also have communities of practice that focus specifically and attempt to do deep dive work and collaboration with our members and our member countries in these particular areas. So some of the specific topics that we target across the different regional partnerships are e-mobility, mini-grids, private sector engagement, bioenergy, clean mobility, green bonds, AFOLU, as well as a couple of others. Specifically for us as the Africa-led Partnership, we were formed in 2012 and the first meeting was held in 2013. At present, we have about 800 members spanning about 35 countries across the continent. And that membership comprises government, project developers, as well as NGOs and a whole range of different other partners. We also work in quite close collaboration with the LEDS Global Partnership Secretariat around the different areas of focus. So there is the Energy Working Group, which works across all regional platforms, the AFOLU Working Group, as well as the Finance Working Group, finance being one of the cross-cutting themes that undergird all of the work that we do. In terms of the Africa-led Partnership, our specific mission is to promote low emissions, low carbon emissions, climate resilient development in support of poverty alleviation on the continent, job creation, as well as sound environmental management. Yeah, so our objectives as the Africa-led Partnership are to promote information exchange and coordination amongst different LEDS programs and country institutions, to cultivate and support LEDS champions across the continent, as well as to enhance capacity for LEDS design and implementation. And this is part of the work that we do through different communities of practice. At the moment, we have community of practice. The current community of practice is the African Minigrids community of practice, which focuses on energy sector. Then we've got 2 others that sit within the AFOLU sector, being the livestock community of practice and the soil organic carbon community of practice. So this particular webinar that we are having today falls under the work that we do within the African Minigrids community of practice, and we are very pleased to have the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Tim Rieber, who works very closely with us at the Secretariat, who is going to be leading today's session. So without further ado, may I hand over to you, Tim. But just before I do that, just a couple of quick remarks in terms of housekeeping. There's a likelihood that we would like to have this as an interactive session, and in the likelihood that there'll be questions arising, we ask that you pop them into the chat window. There also will be moments where the presentations will pause to allow for questions, and if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand, and when you have the microphone, kindly introduce yourself and ask the question. And that way we hope that at the end of the day, we'll have had quite a fruitful discussion with you all on this particular topic. Tim, over to you.
Super, thanks Thanks, Josh, and I'll put my camera on here. It's great to see so many familiar names and virtual faces, I suppose. Just by way of introduction, for those who don't know me, my name's Tim Reber. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory based in Golden, Colorado. And as Josh mentioned, I've been working very closely with the Africa-Leds Partnership, with the African Minigrids community practice, as many of you know already, over the last several years. So today we're here to kick off regional peer learning component of a project that NREL has been working on with funding from the U.S. Department of State called Clean and Advanced Technologies for Sustainable Landscapes. Project is really focused on identifying opportunities to scale up use of agricultural productive uses of energy and doing some analysis, both geospatial analysis and some financial analysis to understand kind of the where and what of what are those productive use opportunities. Just by way of agenda, to give folks a glimpse of where we're going today, I'll be providing a bit of just an introduction and overview of the project. We'll also spend a few minutes on kind of a very fast, high-level sort of primer on productive use of energy. I think most of the folks I see actually signed on are all familiar names, but just to make sure everybody is kind of coming at this from the same angle and really has a similar idea about why we care about productive uses. Then we're actually going to hear from a couple of our colleagues who are partners on this particular project from Zambia and from Kenya, who are going to give a little bit of insight into the collaboration, what we've been doing together over the last 6 months, 12 months or so. And then we'll be hearing from some of our NREL colleagues who are really providing a lot of the deep technical analysis and technical backstopping, looking at both the geospatial analysis approach, as well as the approach we've been taking to understanding what is the sort of the productive use demand and how do we characterize that as sort of annual demand profiles for electricity. Finally wrap up with some questions. So a lot to get through. It's not a huge group yet so far. I suspect some folks will be joining and trickling in as we keep going. But feel free to go ahead and pop your questions into the chat, or please raise your hand and we'll try and capture questions and make it as interactive as possible. As Josh mentioned, certainly don't want to just be talking at folks for the next 90 minutes or so. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So as I mentioned, the CTSL, Clean and Advanced Technologies for Sustainable Landscape Projects, funded by the U.S. Department of State. For 2 years. It's a 2-year-long project. We're just approaching the halfway mark right now, so it actually goes through the end of next December. And the project was conceived with a handful of objectives, primarily increasing access to clean, reliable, affordable electricity through mini grids, making sure that electricity and that power and that work really helps accelerate progress towards local development and economic growth and stability goals. And that's doing that by trying to scale up those agricultural applications. Again, for those colleagues who are part of the AMG-CoP, African Minigrids community practice, we've been talking a lot about productive use over the last year or two. And so really trying to understand and finally kind of start trying to quantify this question of how do you actually define that energy agriculture linkage? What is the quantity of demand and so forth? And how does that really help boost local productivity and local economic situations? And then finally, is everything that we at NREL and that the Africa-Leds Partnership at large really tries to do is making sure that we're doing this in a way that builds sort of in-country technical capacity. So the project kicked off several at the beginning of last year. With a handful of working group meetings, trying to pull together these technical working groups across the countries that we've been working in, making sure that we have that strong base and that strong foundation of individuals to build this capacity. Initially, we've been working with 4 countries, so Kenya, Mozambique, Zambia in Africa, and then also an effort, similar parallel effort going on in Vietnam. Today, we'll be hearing briefly from 2 of those, as I mentioned, from our friends in Kenya and Zambia, and on kind of what we've been doing together over the last year or so, and what we plan to do going forward. And then down here at the bottom here, this graphic just kind of provides a bit of an insight into sort of the overall structure of the project. So, right now, that block on the left here, working to provide tools, training, technical analysis, sort of develop out the methodology and the approach for how do we actually quantify productive use opportunities? How do we quantify the demand? How do we quantify the potential economic benefit and how that actually improves mini grid viability? And how do we do this in a way that builds that local capacity? And then that feeds in later on in the project in the second half into two parallel components. First is peer exchange and lesson sharing. And that's exactly what we're kicking off today. This is just the first of a series of peer exchange sessions we'll have over the second half of this project as we move the country work forward. Hope to have a lot more of these sessions to share these results. And then also providing some support for project development, which is actually being done in partnership with the NDC partnership to build out project concept notes for a handful of pilot projects that hopefully are promising areas for productive use applications and to secure some potential finance for those. So on the first piece of that, on the kind of the step one, the deep analytical work with countries, we've kind of identified a similar approach across the countries we've been working with, which is a two-part approach. The first is starting with this geospatial mapping. So understanding what and where are the agricultural productive use opportunities? How do we understand how those are dispersed on a geographical basis across the countries in which we're working? We've been doing this through a mapping approach using specifically QGIS, which our colleague Evan Rosenlieb will be getting into a little bit later on, providing sort of a summary of the approach. But at the highest level, really doing this geospatial mapping to understand, where does agricultural activity that could benefit from productive use, where is that? How does that line up with renewable energy resources, with population centers, with other energy infrastructure needs and gaps and so forth to understand where those are. And ultimately, this mapping approach will hopefully be feeding into the RE Data Explorer tool, which we'll have a future session on, but actually making some of that agricultural mapping available to make it easy to access. The second piece, and apologies, I don't know why that says one, it should say two there, but is understanding local and broader economic impacts of scaling that up. So specifically for this component, once we understand what are and where are those agricultural opportunities, those productive use opportunities, how do we make the most advantage of those? And so for that, we're planning to do some modeling in NREL's REOPT tool, our renewable energy optimization tool, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And understanding actually how tapping into some of these productive uses can actually improve the viability and decrease the tariffs required and the cost required for clean energy microgrids. And so we've got this kind of 1-2 punch of the geospatial sort of scoping and narrowing, and then the deeper analysis and optimization using some microgrid optimization tools. But no, that's a lot, and kind of we'll be going through this more step by step as we go through the session. But at a higher level, this is kind of the overall analytical approach. So before moving on, I wanted to take a bit of a step back, because we are talking a lot about these productive uses, and just provide a very quick primer. I think for many of you, this will be review. So I'll go through it quick, but did want to make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind who might not be quite as familiar with sort of this concept of productive use. So take just a few minutes here. And so, what do we mean when we're talking about productive use? Effectively, these are any activities that generate income and increase productivity, or most importantly, really help create value chain addition opportunities for local folks. And this can span everything, as many of you know, this spans everything from primary industries to agriculture, timber, fishing, livestock, and so forth, which is really what we'll be focusing on a lot for this project, specifically the agriculture and livestock pieces of it, but can also include other things like manufacturing, retails, folks who, once they're have access to electricity, can start up cafes, salons, and so forth, and even community services like schools, clinics, and churches. Basically anything that can benefit from the use of electricity and help create additional value for the community and its members. As I mentioned, for the CTSL project, we really focused on those agricultural productive uses, so things like irrigation for crop growth, grain milling to create those value chain additions, drying of crops, cold storage for livestock and dairy products, and so forth, but things primarily focused on that sort of agricultural value chain. And And the reason we focus on productive uses, it really has two benefits. The first, of course, is that by tapping into these productive uses, it creates opportunities, kind of enhance the livelihood, create those value chain additions to have those local economic impacts. I think that's a no-brainer that I think we're all pretty familiar with. The other piece, which maybe is a little more complicated and not quite as straightforward, is that by tapping these productive uses, it also increases electricity consumption, and by doing so actually makes mini grids more viable. So it's kind of this cyclical benefit in that tapping productive uses benefits the community, but also lowers the cost of electricity and makes it more attractive for investors, for folks to come in and actually supply electricity because they have a larger sort of aggregate demand base to come use their power. And so again, we kind of went through the different types of productive uses, but what I really wanted to highlight and share on this slide particularly is that depending on the productive use, you might have a different what we call load profile, or sort of daily or seasonal shape to what your electricity demand looks like. As we all know, electricity demand isn't constant. It's going to fluctuate throughout the day, throughout the year as your needs change. And so, when it comes to productive uses, you get a lot of these different sort of shapes. So something like a bar, for example, will have a big spike in the evening as folks typically are hitting the bars in the evening. Something like a church, on the other hand, might have a slightly lower and slightly more constant, similar to a restaurant, might have a small peak at lunch and maybe a slightly larger peak at dinner. But as you can see, really trying to illustrate here that the key to these productive uses is that they have these different shapes, and that shape actually affects the ultimate economics of your mini grids. And so understanding for agricultural applications, what is the shape of these productive uses actually becomes a really key and important part to being able to do this sort of analysis more effectively. And so wanting to try to illustrate this a little bit, so NREL has developed this sort of load profile tool, as we call it, to help us better understand that. And so we've done some analysis looking at two different types of communities, just to do things sort of more of an illustrative basis. So looking first at a community that's primarily residential, you can imagine what sort of your cumulative demand profile would look like. So you might have some overnight, early hours in the morning, people are sleeping. As folks get up and start their day, you get this kind of hump in the middle of the day. And then all of a sudden at night, as folks are starting to come home, turn on their lights, turn on their radios and so forth, you get this big spike in the evening. And what this means is that in order to actually build a mini grid here, you have to build your mini grid so that it's able to provide power for this large peak in the evening. But most of the day, it's only supplying about a third of that. And so you have a mini grid that's basically sitting there unused for a large chunk of the day, meaning that you're not really maximizing the potential power sales and the potential benefit from your mini grid. And so now we can compare this to a load profiler community in which we maybe do some agricultural productive uses. And so if we add in just say like a grain processing mill and maybe a few irrigation pumps, what this does is it has this effect of basically really increasing our daytime consumption of our mini grid. And so the peak stays relatively similar. Maybe it's slightly larger, but by and large at the same place. But we've gone up significantly during the day. And so during the day, we're actually using more power, using more of the capacity of our mini grid that otherwise would just be sitting there idle. And therefore, it really improves the finances and financial benefit of that mini grid, because you're effectively selling more product, electricity, to your customers and making better use of the money that's been invested in your generation assets. And so we've done some analysis, again, using this REOP tool that I mentioned, looking at kind of what does this look like? So the base case is just that residential scenario, and the comparison is that one with that added mill and those added productive uses, including things like irrigation. And you can see, no matter what kind of mini grid we're looking at, that adding in those productive uses ultimately lowers your levelized cost of electricity, meaning that you're going to be able to charge a lower tariff, even though you're selling more power, and maybe even have to build a slightly larger mini grid. The tariff you can charge is lower, so it makes power more accessible, easier, more affordable for everybody by adding in these productive uses. And I think this is the final slide on this sort of brief crash course. Not only does sort of your daily load matter, your seasonal load matters as well. And so you can imagine that, particularly when it comes to things like agriculture, if you have things like a grain mill or processing season, or have agricultural productive uses that are tied to rainfall patterns like irrigation, you won't be using those throughout the whole year. Maybe you have a grain mill that sits idle for 8 months out of the year, and only a few months is it really processing as your crops are coming to market. Or for irrigation, maybe you're doing just natural irrigation most of the year, and there's only a few months of the year where irrigation pumping will really matter. And so thinking about making sure that we find productive uses that are complementary throughout the year on a seasonal basis, as well as sort of that daily basis really matters, because if you have to size your mini grid for that 1 or 2 months out of the year where you're milling your cassava or whatever it is, but most of the year it's not being used, that's actually going to create a significant burden. And so trying to find out how we can kind of hit that sweet spot of ensuring that the seasonality also aligns is very, very important. So I know that's a lot. That kind of wraps up our sort of the brief primer. Instead of hearing from us about how this is starting to take shape in countries, we wanted to hand it over to some of our colleagues from our partner countries. We have Professor Francis Yamba from Zambia and Esther Wangombe from Kenya. Before turning it to our country partners, though, I wanted to stop here to see if there were any questions on anything that we've mentioned so far about kind of the background and productive use, background of the project, before we start diving into some of the specifics about how we're really doing. I will take the silence as meaning that no questions, and certainly we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So with that, I wanted to go ahead and first invite Professor Francis Yamba from the Center for Engineering, Energy and Environment of Zambia, who's assisting us and working together with NREL on implementing this project in Zambia, to go ahead and come off mute and walk through a few slides that Professor Yamba has put together. And I can go ahead and click through the slides for you, Professor Yamba, so you can just let me know next when you want me to go ahead.
Yes, you can go ahead, Tim. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning for some of you are in the morning. Yes, I think our work will start by giving the introduction, building on the history of successful and productive cooperation in the past. NREL partnered with the government of Zambia and the Center for Energy, Environment and Engineering, CZ in short, as one of the 6 focus countries for the CTLCL program. They became now 4 in the actual implementation. Next slide. Of the 3 potential areas of focus, Zambia chose to collaborate in a geospatial mapping of opportunities for productive use of energy to support energy access. We've done this exercise. We've identified the areas where we can do this productive use, and of course, where there is no electricity, and then support for improved understanding and development of business cases to finance productive use for energy access. Here, we've got yet to do this. Next slide. Yes, we've identified productive uses in use areas in agriculture, which are ongoing or have potential. These include groundnut processing, looking at potential for renewable energy to help power nut processing machinery to produce peanut butter from groundnuts, thereby creating value-added product and increasing shelf life. Crop farming, looking at opportunity for renewable to power both cold storage and productive drying in order to increase shelf life of crop production. Yes, we've done a lot of work on this. We've developed some load profiles. Dairy and livestock, assessing opportunities for off-grid renewable energy to power cold storage to extend shelf life of dairy products. And I think we've done more work on this and developed load profiles for it. Palm oil, assessing the off-grid renewable energy requirement to power equipment for processing of palm oil on site after palm oil harvest, thereby adding value to it. We've got to do this yet. Fish farming, assessing opportunities for off-grid solar PV to be deployed along with water pumps to enhance opportunity for fish farming or cooperatives. Next slide. Yes, membership of the technical working group. We have the focal point, which is the Ministry of National Development Planning, which is the National Designated Authority, who is the lead coordinator. We've got our center, CZ, as the lead on the technical aspect. And we've got members from Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Energy, University of Zambia, and the ZAM Statistics, who regularly attend our meetings. Thank you. Next slide. Yes, how this work fits into Zambia's energy agriculture goals. Energy drives the economy and is important in enhancing the well-being of humans. Energy is important for food storage, cold, increasing shelf life, processing, irrigation during extended dry periods. Like now, we suspect to have a drought this year. The rains have not come. I hope that they do come eventually, but if they don't come, yes, we can use irrigation, powering appliances, communication and entertainment and businesses. Next slide. Just now, that is Kenya's presentation. I'll finish mine. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Professor Yamba, for walking us through that. It's been certainly a pleasure working with the Zambia working group and working with SEAS and the NDA and Ministry of National Development Planning and others on this project. We've made some good progress, and certainly some of our NREL colleagues are going to walk through in a little bit more detail momentarily what that exactly that looks like. I believe we were going to hear from our colleague Esther Wangombe from the Kenya Ministry of Environment. However, I don't actually see her on right now. Is Esther on?
Yeah, Tim, I don't see her either. I've just sent an email reminder with the link just in case she's able to join. It's possible that she's probably just a little bit delayed. So I will let you know if she does join at some point, and then maybe we can come back to this.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Maybe we can hear from Esther later on if she ends up joining. But she had also put together a couple of slides, similarly walking through sort of the makeup of the working group, similar to with Zambia in Kenya. We had similar sort of kickoff meetings at the beginning of last year to put together a working group consisting of folks from the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Agriculture, Regional Center for Mapping, Ministry of Interior, specifically the Department of Resource Surveys and Remote Sensing, and a lot of folks who make up sort of what's called Kenya's Geospatial Planning Unit, or GIS Planning Unit, which is responsible for geospatial energy planning within Kenya. So they've all been part of the Kenya working group, working on identifying similar to in Zambia, identifying some of those specific agricultural productive use priorities, and then working through the analytical approach. So I think we will go ahead and I'll try and skip this and come back to Esther if and when she ultimately joins us. Allow her to talk through that and move on to kind of a high-level view of the analytical approach. So this is a very complicated slide, and we'll spend a couple minutes walking through this, but effectively through the work that we've been doing with country partners, with Zambia, with Kenya, now with Mozambique, and as well as Vietnam and others, we've sort of established this workflow. And so there's, as mentioned, as you probably remember from early on in the presentation in the beginning, there's kind of this two-pronged approach or two-phased approach to the analysis here. The first is doing this geospatial mapping. And so the goal really here is to understand what and where are the sort of highest priority productive use opportunities. And in order to do that, we spent a lot of time early on in the project pulling together some of the key input data for this. So there's a lot of agricultural data that went into it, understanding land use patterns, specifically trying to get a better understanding of crop production and yields, and understanding this from a geospatial perspective. So, looking for crop production maps where they exist, livestock poultry map. So, any data information we could find on counting sort of how many livestock heads, how many heads of cattle, specifically how many heads of that cattle might be dairy cattle. For poultry, things like how many chickens or what is the estimated number of chickens on a particular farm in an area. Tying this with things like weather and rainfall data to understand what are the irrigation needs or what are the seasonality of crop production. So pulling a lot of this agricultural data piece in is kind of one key linchpin for this analysis. The second piece is renewable energy resource availability. This is a little bit easier. We have the RE Data Explorer tool that NREL has developed, which actually has a lot of renewable energy resource data already in there. And so it's pretty easy to pull that RE resource availability. And the importance of that is understanding, as I mentioned, the seasonality of crop production, of irrigation needs, and particularly the seasonality of agricultural productive uses compared to other productive uses really matters in understanding, well, how does that align with the seasonality of and variation in potential renewable energy resource availability. And then the final important piece of this is this bottom one, sort of the energy and infrastructure and demographic data. So trying to pull in electrification information, where is their existing electricity infrastructure, where are their community locations, where we don't have maps of community locations, things like population density and so forth. And one thing I want to flag is that for the top two here, for the agricultural data and the renewable energy data, we actually have sort of universal Pan-African data sets that we're using. So actually, thanks to some of our colleagues over at the USDA, we've managed to identify a handful of Pan-African crop production data sets that we've used. And similarly, for the renewable energy information pulling from NREL's RE Data Explorer tool, we have that. And so those first two components are things that we actually can and are planning to do on sort of an Africa-wide basis. And so I wanted to mention that because I think that's really important for sort of the second half of the project as we get further into some of the regional learning and peer exchange pieces, is that a lot of the foundation for this type of analysis and this type of work is actually already there and should be easy to build on. What's a little more challenging is that bottom piece in the bottom left, the energy infrastructure data. Energy infrastructure is vastly different from country to country. Both in terms of what sort of energy infrastructure is there, the availability of data and information on that. A lot of this information is maintained and held by the Ministry of Energy or local utilities and so forth. Maybe is presented in different formats and of different quality. And so there's not yet, at least that we're aware of, if anybody is aware, please let us know, but a sort of a uniform energy, electricity infrastructure map for Africa, so to speak. And so that last piece is something that we're having to kind of pull in ad hoc for each country. So all of these pieces are feeding into the geospatial mapping. And the output of that is sort of this intermediate output, again, identifying kind of the where and the what of possible agricultural productive use opportunities. As sort of a side output of that, as I mentioned, we are hoping to put this map, specifically the agricultural productive use map, into the RE Data Explorer. So watch out next year, sometime hopefully early to mid next year, we'll have another session to share that. But we are looking to have more of a regional Pan-African map for at least the agricultural data and the renewable energy data and how those two align. So stay tuned for that. Once we finish the geospatial mapping piece, we then feed in here to phase 2 analysis, which is really the techno-economic modeling that's being done in our REOPT or Renewable Energy Optimization tool. And so once we have these PUE opportunities, we need to feed in a little bit more information. So that's where development of these agricultural load profiles, these daily and seasonal load profiles, as well as information on cost. How much does it cost to purchase and build mini-grids and mini-grid components? That all feeds into the REOPT tool. And from there, once we've identified a handful of priority sites, we're looking to have optimum site configurations and ultimately identify a few priority areas that we can feed into some project concept notes, project information notes I mentioned early on, ultimately for the hope that we can actually get some of those maybe developed or at least help secure financing for some of those projects. So I know that's that's an awful lot there, and there's a lot on the slide. We will make these slides available after the session for sure, but just wanted to kind of walk through this kind of two-phase, the geospatial mapping, the data that goes into it, and then the sort of the REOPT techno-economic analysis piece. Since we did mention REOPT, I also wanted to give a brief overview of the REOPT tool. And so, you know, how REOPT works, the piece that we're using for phase 2 of the analysis, you have to put in, you know, look different technology options. And so this is where having this renewable energy resource data is very important. Adding into this sort of electricity load profile, so the community load profile, the productive use load profile, and then the economic piece is there at the top. What are the technology costs? What are the incentives and financial parameters of the project? REOPT takes all these and actually puts out sort of the optimal configuration. So it'll let you know based on this load profile, based on this resource availability, based on these technology costs, you know, the optimum technology mix, even sort of how you dispatch these on a daily basis, again, which is why it's really important to have that daily load profile and not just a single estimate of you know, what is your total energy consumption. And then the economics, the capital and operational costs and levelized costs of electricity. And so this is the tool we're using for a lot of the latter techno-economic analysis. So what that ultimately looks like is by developing these load profiles, these productive use load profiles for irrigation, refrigeration, other agricultural uses, coupling those with residential uses, and then taking the mapping, the geospatial mapping we're doing, and identifying sort of which points, which cells on the geospatial map are most attractive, plugging those into REOPT, and ultimately that will kick out you know, what is your aggregate productive use demand for that grid cell, and what is the cost optimal microgrid technology and size, and the least cost. And by doing this, we can kind of start to identify in priorities, right? These are the areas in this particular country that might be of highest priority and highest interest, and could potentially benefit most from productive uses of energy. So I think that's where I'm gonna pause on kind of the background. I know that's an awful lot. We have our colleagues here, Evan Rosenlieb, who's with NREL's Geospatial Data Sciences team, who's going to walk through a little bit about how we're doing the mapping approach and what that looks like. And then later on, we'll also be hearing from Darlene Stewart and Amanda Farthing, who've been working a lot on developing these agricultural load profiles. But before moving into kind of the specifics of what this analysis looks like, did want to stop again here to see if there are any questions, comments, concerns, additions. I know we do have Francis and others on the line in case they wanted to add anything to what we've gone over so far. I see one question here in the chat box. What type of data are the most challenging to acquire? I would say by and large, pretty much all of it. For different reasons. The agricultural data, I think, has been fairly challenging because there's just so much of it and so many different crops that have different characteristics, different water needs, different seasonality, and then trying to align that with things like livestock and dairy production. There's just a lot of different formats and different types of agricultural data. So that's been challenging. However, we do have, as I mentioned, a pretty good data set from colleagues over at the US Department of Agriculture that we've been using for that. So that's certainly helped. On the flip side, the energy infrastructure data also is challenging, and I think for a different reason, mostly because that's on such a country by country basis. There's not exactly a single sort of Pan-African regional electricity infrastructure data set or map anywhere. And so that one has to be done on a much more individualized case-by-case basis. So I think both of those can be challenging, but for different reasons. But good question. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I guess we can just keep moving along. So over to Evan, I guess, to talk us through a little bit about what exactly this geospatial mapping is looking like.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, go ahead and go to the first slide here. So, as Tim was saying, something that's been important for us, and this project has been able to rely on either global or at the very least continental scale data sets to use, because we do hope to be able to take that first part of the flow diagram that Tim was showing, the geospatial mapping part, and at least really be able to hone in on areas that we think are highest priority for potential agricultural productive uses and potential mini-grids, and host that on our Renewable Energy Data Explorer in order to be able to help disseminate this data publicly to anybody that wants to be able to use it, and facilitate people being able to use it for their own means and do their own analysis. And as Tim was saying, the electrical infrastructure data has been more difficult to find. However, we have identified a good array of data sets that are helping us answer the questions that we want to answer, particularly on the agricultural production side and some related issues. So the first step of our approach then is just identifying what these data sets are, and then on our side, on the geospatial analysis side, being able to download these data sets and get them all on get them all sort of clipped and aligned in the same area and aligned to the same grid. So, for example, here on this first slide, we have an example of what average annual solar irradiation looks like for the study region here, which is useful because that helps us predict which areas are going to have better or worse solar production from photovoltaic plants, which is important to be able to size the systems correctly. This is from this particular raster is from the Global Solar Atlas, project supported by the World Bank, and it's a really great project. On the right here, we have population data estimates, also on a sort of the same sort of grid. This is from the gridded population of the world data set, which is produced by a center at Columbia University, and it's a very useful data set for us. And so this is part of the work here on the geospatial side, is being able to take these data sets, which don't necessarily start on the same coverage, the same extent of coverage, or the same spatial resolution, and being able to do geospatial analysis and manipulations on the data so that they are aligned on the same grid and extent, so that we can then compare them one-to-one for any given area. So as you can see here, these two data sets, despite not having the same native resolution or native extent, what we've done here is we've taken them and just clipped them to the study area and put them on the same grid, so that they are for any given location, they are lined exactly on top of each other, so you can get a good estimate of the population area as well as its solar activity. Next slide. And then two other examples here, and these data sets are really large data sets. This is just a mere peek into the data that's available here. In particular, on the left here, this is an example of estimates of maize production in just raw production per year per grid cell, and this comes from the SPAM project is actually the name of it, which is funded ultimately by IFPRI and CGIAR, and ultimately also supported by the World Bank. So in the future, meetings, we'll have a little bit more of a deep dive into this data set. But ultimately, it's put together by an organization that combines a lot of different data sources. It does take agricultural census data from countries as one of its very primary inputs, but it combines that data with remotely sensed data, so satellite data and other data in order to try to predict with very high spatial resolution where crops are being grown. And then there's a fairly similar project as well that's also supported by IFPRI that does the same thing for livestock counts. So getting the same sort of estimate per grid cell of total amount of head of cattle, for example, although there's also estimates for chicken, goats, and whatnot. And and for the crops, maize is just one of, I think, I'm trying to remember here, I think it's 18 or 19 crops that they cover. So there's a lot of information in that data set: maize, coffee, tea, sugar, groundnuts, yams. It really covers a pretty wide gamut of the most common crops. And in addition, just to production, it also has some another data set that we're using with this is also just an estimate on the area of that crop being grown. So in combination, the area of the crop being grown in production, you can also get estimates of yield, and these features are feed into our irrigation analysis. Next slide. And then the final large bit of data that we've identified so far that's been feeding into our analysis so far, again, I already mentioned irrigation. We've heard from multiple stakeholders that irrigation is one of the most important potential agriculture productive uses. It takes a lot of energy. It's very important, obviously, particularly for areas that are productive agricultural areas, but have a little bit less reliable rainfall. And so trying to be able to model the energy use and the location and timing of irrigation, energy use for irrigation has been one of our primary goals so far in the project. So to be able to do that, we have to have some idea of how much irrigation is required in an area. And fortunately, we were able to identify one more project, a global Varidity Index dataset, which shows in general how wet or dry any particular areas, and that's the image you see here. Hopefully this looks about right to you. It makes sense to me based off my understanding, and this combines several data sets. Obviously, precipitation is a very important data set here, but also it includes data on an estimate of average annual evapotranspiration, so how much water leaves any particular area based off of how hot it is and how windy it is. And so it uses other climatic variables here to help understand what the balance of moisture is in any given area. So this is great, but there's only so much we can tell from just an annual average. Obviously, if you're growing a crop in the wet season, it doesn't really matter how wet or dry it is in the dry season, or vice versa, perhaps. So this was great, but we decided we need to dig deeper here. So next slide. So using some of the same data set that was available through that project, they do have estimates of the average evapotranspiration by month in that in available through that same project, and then using the methods that they have in their methodology paper, and as well the precipitation data set that they linked. What we were able to do is take the precipitation data for all 12 months and the evapotranspiration data for all 12 months and combine it to get a monthly aridity index data. So this is really exciting. We think this is going to be a very useful data set, and we'll hear more about how this feeds into our irrigation analysis in a bit. What you can see here, though, is exactly how these data sets all model the aridity index throughout the continent on a month-by-month basis. So, as the bands of moisture moves farther north during the summer, and then it moves farther south during the winter. So reaching sort of the southern reaches of the continent in December, January, and reaching the northern reaches in July, August. Next slide. Another important part of being able to estimate irrigation data for electricity usage is to have some idea of how to calibrate what this aridity index means. This aridity index by itself is just sort of a number. It just gives you a general idea of if a place is dry or wet. We didn't really have a good idea of how to translate that into how much irrigation was required. Fortunately, however, we do have some data in the U.S. That we are able to identify on the amount of crop irrigation that's required for maize in the United States. And we're able to use the same data set that I produced for Africa for the US to look at what the relationship is between the growing season, the aridity index during the growing season, and how much inches of irrigation are required. So each dot here is a different state, and the size of the dot is the amount of maize production. And so as you can see here, the lower the aridity index, the higher amount of irrigation in inches of irrigation is required throughout the growing season. And it's a pretty strong and linear relationship. And so we're able to use this data to help inform using the monthly data that was shown in the previous slide. How do we translate those numbers that are produced into how much irrigation is required for maize? And we can repeat this process for other crops. Next slide. So ultimately what we're able to do is combine all of these data sets into stack them on top of each other and create a series of points for any given place within the study area. And each point has data on all of these data sets we've mentioned. So for any given location, we're able to tell what the population is, to estimate the baseload electricity use, what the predicted amount of maize production is, groundnut production is, sugar production is, whatever crops are common there. The average number of heads of cattle for milk refrigeration, and as well as the aridity index values and the solar radiation values to be able to predict irrigation values and solar production. So we have all that now. Any given location, which is essentially a 10 by 10 kilometer area, we have a good idea for that, relatively small unit of analysis of what all those data points are. So this is just an example for what we've been doing in Zambia, and we've been doing similar things in our other study countries so far. We can then take those points and find which points are not close to the current electrical grid. We assume that points that are close to the current electrical grid are either more likely to be electrified or are going to be easier to hook up to the current transmission grid instead of having to build a mini grid for them. And so that's what you can see here. These dots are potential study area sites that have all this data associated with them and are outside of the current grid. Next slide. I think this is my final slide. And then just to give you one example of how we start using all of this data, once it's in the same format, we can combine the data and start focusing in on areas that seem to be high in productive use opportunity. So this is just one example. There's a lot we could go into, but we'll get in those in future meetings. But just as an example, what we can do here is combine the monthly aridity index data along with, in this example again, maize production data. And this is in Kenya, we can identify sites that have on the left side, these are areas that have relatively high maize production, but are relatively dry. And so these are areas that we identified that probably need some irrigation support during the wet season. So, you know, generally they produce maize and but they're in a little bit drier areas, and they're either already using irrigation and using diesel generators for it, or perhaps their crops aren't as reliable as they could be. On the right, by looking at areas that have high maize production and high rainfall and a high aridity index value, we're able to identify places that grow a lot of corn during the wet season and perhaps are good candidates to start irrigating in the dry season and start producing a second crop of maize. And so those areas could grow 2 crops of maize in a year instead of 1 crop. So this is just one example of how, by using all of this data together, we can start honing in on very specific areas where we think are good candidates for specific productive uses. All right, I think that's what I got. Yeah, I definitely. Please let me know any questions, comments, or concerns. And yeah, Tim or anybody else on the team, let me know if I forgot anything there.
No, I think that was great, Evan. Thanks so much for walking us through that. You know, as I think Evan mentioned, there's a lot that's going into this analysis, certainly. You know, this is just some initial examples. The only thing I'd like to flag is that, you know, you saw early on that a lot of those are sort of Pan-African maps. And so as Evan mentioned, one, we'll be diving even further into this in future meetings. And two, a lot of this data, particularly the agricultural opportunity areas, will eventually be made available on a regional Africa basis and uploaded to the RE Explorer tool. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll have a session specifically on that. You know, we're just sort of piloting the approach and analysis methodology with our initial handful of countries. So thanks, Evan. I think it probably makes sense to actually go ahead and dive into the second piece of this, which is development of the load profiles. I do see that Esther joined us. Hi, Esther. Thanks for joining us. But maybe finish up with the analytical approach, and then come back to Esther and hear how it's being all applied in Kenya, if that makes sense. So without any further ado, and hey, John, good to see you. Yeah, absolutely. We will share the presentations afterwards, for sure. I will go ahead and invite Amanda and Darlene. I think Amanda first, to talk about sort of the flip side of this, and the complementary side, which is how we develop the load profiles for productive uses, starting with sort of the residential pieces.
Thanks, Tim. This is Amanda here. So as Tim mentioned, now we're diving into phase 2, as Tim had described previously. And so one of the first steps of phase 2 of developing out the load profiles is to estimate the load profile for the community in absence of the productive uses of energy. So these community load profiles are intended to encompass the load for residential households as well as commercial and public entities. And the idea here is to use REOP to determine the cost of electricity and the microgrid sizing to serve these community loads, and then to additionally evaluate what the optimal microgrid outcomes would be with the productive uses of energy on top of the community loads. So in developing these community load profiles, we are using NREL's Microgrid Load Profile Explorer tool, which is linked at the bottom of this slide. It's a publicly available tool that can estimate hourly load given a small number of inputs. So namely, those inputs are the number of households, the income distribution of the households, and the commercial and public entities, the number of commercial and public entities being water pumps, milling operations, small shops, schools, clinics, and streetlights. Next slide, please. And so within the tool, there are a number of assumptions around the number of appliances for each household, the hourly appliance usage, the daily consumption for each commercial entity, and the operational hours of each of the commercial entities listed on the left. Next slide. And so with those inputs and assumptions, the output of this tool is, as you can see, an hourly load profile over the course of a day for the households shown in green, the commercial entities shown in purple, and then the aggregate community load shown in blue. Next slide. And so our goal is to do this estimation of community load for each of the 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells that Evan mentioned previously. So we want to use country-specific data to estimate the number of households and commercial and public entities in each of those grid cells based off of the information that we have for that grid cell. So based primarily off of the population of that grid cell. And so this is just an example of the process for Kenya, in which we have a data set that has the number of health facilities and schools by county per 1,000 population. Next slide, please. And so we can use this data, the number of health facilities and schools, to then estimate, make assumptions and estimate the number of the other commercial and public entities per 1,000 population. And I won't go through the details of this, but this is just an example of how we might arrive at the number of each of these entities given the population of a particular 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell. Next slide, please. And so with these inputs, then just again reiterating that with these inputs, then from that microgrid load profile explorer tool, we can obtain this community load without the productive uses. And so now I think Darlene will go through developing some of the load profiles for the productive uses, which will then be combined with these community load estimates. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. This is Darlene here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about irrigation and also just kind of touch on the work that we've been doing looking at refrigeration for dairy products. So this first slide, I'm really grateful to Evan for giving us such a great overview of the Aridity Index data and how we have arrived at a relationship between the aridity indexes and irrigation needs for maize. So I won't have to go through that too much more, but I want to just kind of highlight a couple of things. So in addition to the aridity index data that Evan described, we also need information about the crop days to maturity and then some information about the actual pumping power requirements. So we need something, some information about the pump power and the flow rate and the head of fluid, so how high the water can be pumped. And then we can combine the aridity index data that Evan described, which gives us the relationship to the inches of irrigation that's needed, and the crop area, the hectares of actual cropped area within each of the grid cells. And that can give us, for each grid cell, the actual kilowatt hours per month that's needed for each crop. So we can do that for each grid cell, as Evan described earlier. And if you want to go on to the next slide, Tim. So on this side, we have, these are all actually for Kenya, and I want to just kind of describe this chart a little bit. The green bars here, it's a little bit hard to read for you guys, but the green bars here represent the aridity index for this grid cell, and a little bit counterintuitively, the higher aridity indexes represent times of the year when there is actually more moisture available, so more water available. And then the blue are our calculation of the amount of irrigation needed. So in this particular instance, so this is a grid cell that it's an area of the country that's a little bit drier, and the rainfall is a little bit more divided into very much more distinct wet and dry seasons. And as Evan mentioned earlier, we decided to look at a strategy for these areas where we would provide supplemental irrigation during the wet season to stabilize the moisture for that crop and allow to get the highest yield possible for one crop per year. So this represents a situation where we're irrigating during the wet season to supplement the water for this crop. And they, in most of the drier areas in Kenya, look very similar to this in terms of the amount of irrigation that we would need for this scenario. So one thing I want to point out here too is that the daily profile that we have shown here really matches the solar output. So in this case, the strategy would be to pump water during the day when we have solar energy available for our microgrid. But it could be stored, and especially if you could pump it up to a higher level, you could store it and then use gravity feed irrigation at night, which people often want to do to save water and make their irrigation more efficient. So, so that's the strategy that we're kind of hoping to look at here. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this is an irrigation strategy that, as Evan and Tim both mentioned, and also Amanda, we want to kind of have these productive uses even out over the course of the year so that we don't have, big spikes in use. So irrigation, it looks like from this analysis, it looks like irrigation is a great productive use, but we would want to have other complementary uses that would help spread out this load over the year. So this is again an aridity index based strategy for one crop with supplemental irrigation during the wet season. If you want to go on to the next slide, Tim. So this is the other strategy that we looked at in somewhat wetter areas of the country, where we might want to irrigate during the dry season to allow for a second crop of maize. So in this case, we're irrigating during December, January, and February in order to grow a second crop of maize. So those are kind of the two strategies that we looked at for irrigation. And if you want to go on to the next slide, Tim. So I kind of just plotted these side by side, and you can see that the two strategies are quite different. The dry season irrigation requires a lot more energy, and it's also during a different time of the year than the wet season supplemental irrigation. So just a couple of kind of notes here. One way that we could add additional productive uses and also use perhaps our same equipment would be to perhaps support a vegetable crop during the off season for maize. These crops tend to be pretty water intensive. For example, field grown tomatoes can require 35 to 40 liters per kilogram of tomato. They're also high value crops, so they're quite helpful for farmers if they can grow those. And they can also be grown in small kind of intensive plots so that they don't take up too much space. And so perhaps, the question that we want to continue to look at here as we go through this process is how we can combine these productive uses to maximize the benefits of water pumping. So I wanted to pause here. Are there any questions so far? I think Evan did such a great job of discussing the aridity indexes. He made it very simple for me. So if there's any questions, that would be great. It looks like no questions so far. So Tim, if you want to go on to the next slide. So dairy refrigeration, this is a productive use where we are looking at refrigeration of milk to increase its shelf life and to prevent spoilage of the milk, primarily kind of right after milking the cows, and in the next couple days, just to store the milk long enough so that it can be transported perhaps to a central processing facility, or kept cold long enough for the family that's itself to use it, or it to be consolidated with other farmers' products. So as Evan mentioned earlier, we have cattle identified in our geographic data sets. We made the very generous assumption that all of those cattle are dairy cows. So this is probably not a great assumption, and it's especially not a great assumption for some particular areas in the countries that we're looking at. But I do want to point out that we are also looking at grid cells where there is a fair amount of maize production. So these are not the very remote areas that have perhaps more migratory people who have, I believe, a different kind of cows that are not really producing a lot of milk. So this is more, these are off-grid areas, but they are also more settled areas where people are growing maize. They have farm plots, and so the assumption that these are dairy cows is perhaps not as terrible for those areas. But this is an area, again, where we would really love to have help from in-country folks who can tell us, even for specific grid cells, what the ratio of dairy cows is to other types of cattle. So we also assumed that the average milk production is about 15 liters per day per cow. Again, this is kind of assuming that the cows are getting pretty good nutrition. They're pretty productive. And then we assumed about 300 kilograms of milk goes to feeding a calf for that cow. So some of the milk will be diverted to feeding a calf. And then 1 to 2 kilograms per day are used by the family for their own use. And also the kind of the final assumption is that about 30% the cows are producing milk at any given time. The rest are sort of follow and not producing milk. So all of that combined together gives us about 4.4 kilograms of milk per cow per day that could be for sale, and we would want to chill that milk. And so this is averaged over all the cattle in that 10-kilometer grid cell. So if you want to go on to the next slide, Tim. So this is just kind of a refrigeration energy use slide. I'll skip mostly over this, but we were able to find a solar chiller example that I think would kind of mirror what we're looking for the type of equipment that we would use for a chiller for milk. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I assume 2 days of storage for the milk, and then 2 milkings per day, so morning and evening milking. There's actually sort of a standard for milk chilling that the milk has to be chilled within 2 hours. This is, for sale. I'm not sure whether that is kind of a universal standard, but I think it's a good one to kind of benchmark this process. And we also assumed that that the milk would be combined into kind of a larger a larger vessel. So about 200 liters is kind of the assumption that I made. So this all works out to about 0.024 kilowatt hours per kilogram of milk. So that's the total electricity requirement for chilling that milk. And I benchmarked that against the US dairy industry, which benchmarked very nicely against the US dairies. So moving on to the final slide. So this is how that kind of all works out from an energy use standpoint. So for 2 milkings per day, you kind of have these big spikes when you're chilling that milk when you first get it. And then there's kind of like a baseline energy use to keep that milk cold for over the course of the 2 days. So you have a load profile that has this kind of morning and evening kind of spike to it. And then the total kilowatt hours per day ranges from about 100 to 750 kilowatt hours per day for each 10-kilometer grid cell with cattle in Kenya. So that's kind of all I had for those. So again, as Amanda was saying, we want to combine these productive uses with the community load profiles to develop our total load profile for the mini grid. And I'm sure you're seeing that there are a lot of different productive uses that we can look at, and they all have very different sort of characteristics. So it's a bit of a balancing act to try to kind of combine them all in a way that makes this the most efficient from an energy use standpoint. So if there's any other questions, I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Thanks, Darlene and Amanda before that for walking us through that, and yeah, and think just to reiterate, I'm sure you can all see there's a lot of different productive uses. We basically just walked through 3, sort of the residential uses, and then the irrigation and refrigeration. But there's certainly other productive uses as the project goes on that we'll continue adding to this list. So I think that's everything we had for today. As I mentioned, this is a kind of a work in progress, and there's a lot going. But before we move into the final sort of Q&A and discussion, I do see that Esther has joined us, and apologies, Esther, there was confusion on the time, maybe caused by me. So thanks for joining us, Esther, and maybe to kind of help wrap things up. We saw earlier from Zambia, kind of early on, how the Zambia work is taking shape, and maybe we can take this moment to go back to the slides Esther had put together and hear a little bit about what this is looking like in Kenya. So Esther, would you like to take it over for a couple minutes here, help bring us into the final stretch?
Thank you, Tim. And sorry, I think the time confusion, I'm sorry, because I was waiting to join at 6. But that aside, I am happy to briefly talk about the work that is progressing in Kenya on the clean and advanced technologies for sustainable landscapes program in Kenya. This was started in February of this year, and the program we hope it will run to 2020 or beyond. And the institutions involved in the country include our ministry, that's Ministry of Energy. And within the Ministry of Energy, we also have a planning unit, a GIS planning unit, which is also very key in this work. And then we have brought on board the Ministry of Agriculture. And within the Ministry of Agriculture, we have livestock, a person from livestock, another one from agriculture itself, and another one from the Department of Fisheries. And then apart from that, we have brought on board the Regional Center for Mapping. This Center for Mapping, it actually covers many countries in Africa, but they have their headquarters here in Nairobi. So we have brought them on board as well. We also have brought on board the Ministry of Interior. And within that, we have brought a department called Department of Resource Survey and Remote Sensing. This is not all. Probably with the time, we will bring on board other institutions as the project evolves. The next one. So the progression of activities, actually, before that, of course, the objective, I'm sure the objective of the whole project had been introduced before I joined. So let me talk about the progression of activities in Kenya. We have the advisory support from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US, led by Team Labor. And we also, I mean, they're assisting us in doing the in-depth analysis of the information that we provided. Ministry of Agriculture provided some data to them, and also our GIS planning unit has also been giving them information, and also our remote sensing department. So they have been doing some in-depth analysis of all that we have been feeding into them. And I want to say that they have not been leaving us aside. It is also a part of capacity building us on the same. We also have the geospatial mapping and data analysis. They actually, Team Labor and the team, they are leading us in this. And we are also learning from the analysis. And through that, identification of opportunities that are informing the energy, water, agriculture sectors is emerging. And through the information that we are gathering, we hope to develop impact assessment frameworks that will guide policy in future, and also they will help us as a country in guiding us in the developing future projects where we will have now more of agriculture and energy and water. The next one. And the preliminary findings in Kenya, as the last presenter has just presented, is that one, in Kenya, we have small-scale farmers who do a lot of small-scale irrigation, and irrigation power use is being done. So that this is being captured by this particular project. Then we have the daily refrigeration process. What this means is that our small-scale farmers, they milk their cows, they deliver their milk to some correction points. So if they can make use of the energy from mini-grids or energy from solar energy to refrigerate the milk, they will have the milk will have a longer lifespan, other than the farmer milking and taking straight away to the correction points. In Kenya, we have the milling operations. That is, we have what we call the portion mills, where grains are milled to make flour for cooking porridge, for cooking ugali, and among other foodstuffs. So these processes also use energy. And if we can be able to link this energy with our mini-grid, whatever we are generating from the mini-grids, whatever we are generating from power, because the mining operations, they are mined under the Ministry of Agriculture, and some are even owned privately. So there is a lot we are learning from this particular project. Also, water pumping operations, which are done sometimes manually in the country, and sometimes we use the windmills, and also solar water pumping. All these information is being consolidated under this particular project, and there is so much that is coming up. So all these processes, among others, they use energy. Next one. So this is actually work in progress in Kenya, and under the Ministry of Energy, we do have the greater part of the country does not have the national grid. We have the mini grids, the solar, biogas energy, among other ways of generating electricity. So when we hope to connect what we are doing under the Ministry of Energy with what data that this particular program is assisting us in consolidating. And the program actually is offering opportunities for productive use of energy to support energy access and agricultural productivity in the country. And we are hoping that the information generated will help us in future planning purposes. And thank you so much, Team Labor and your team. There's so much that we look forward to learning through this particular program. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Esther. And certainly we've been learning a lot through it too. And it's been a pleasure working with you and with the entire Kenya team, as well as the Zambia team, Mozambique, and other project teams as well. And thanks for wrapping us up. I think we planned earlier, but I actually think it worked quite well to have you finish up and kind of highlight how this work will be used in Kenya and hopefully with other partner countries as well. So that wraps up everything we had planned for today. I know we're already 4 minutes over our planned time, but you know, we can stick around and have a little bit of discussion, answer any questions. You know, one thing I'll flag is that, you know, as Esther mentioned and others, it still is a work in progress. We're only about 1 year into our 2-year program. So right now we're just kicking off the regional sharing component of it, kind of sharing initial approaches and methodologies. And as we go forward with the country work with Kenya, Zambia, Mozambique, Vietnam, we'll be having additional peer learning and sharing sessions like this to kind of provide continual updates as the project continues. So certainly stay tuned. But in the meantime, I wanted to stop and before we close up, kind of open it up for question and answer. And I thought maybe to help guide that, I'll leave it on this very confusing slide, which kind of highlights the overall analysis workflow, just to give folks a chance to kind of look at that as we open it up for questions. So yeah, keen to hear from all of you, feedback, concerns, suggestions on the approach, if this is going on in your country, or basically any comments or questions.
Thanks, Tim. We've got a question from Suzio. Suzio, your hand is up. Please just unmute yourself and go ahead. There we go.
Yes, sorry, I was, yeah. Basically, it's a comment or a request. I've seen, I think maybe amount of work has been done in our country. I just wanted to mention that we have planned mini-grids which we want to deploy. There are quite a number of them. I think there'll be more than 200, maybe specifically to say 226 dotted around the country. So I'm looking at the analysis that has been done in terms of how we can inform them and see how they can benefit from the productive uses related to agriculture in terms of promoting sustainability to the mini-grids. So it would be kind of you if you can at least maybe share the information. I think going forward, I'll try as much as possible also to invite those grant beneficiaries to be part of the presentation so that they can see what information can be beneficial for them going forward so as to sustain this deployment of infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzio. That's a great point. And yeah, absolutely keen to work with Rhea and others. And certainly I think Rhea, I don't know, I believe Rhea actually was maybe invited to join the working group, but I think as much as we can work closely together on that, absolutely. One thing I could imagine would be if there are known locations for those 220 mini grids, possibly bringing them into the mapping effort and seeing how that overlays with the resource data and particularly the agricultural productive use data, I think would be a really valuable sort of supplemental side analysis to do. So absolutely, maybe we can catch up offline with Professor Yamba and others from the Zambia team on all of that.
Yes, definitely. We can get that data and then align with them. What's most important here is to develop a load profile first. And then you do the design and the rest of the economics coming. Thank you. Susan.
Sorry, Professor, I'm being caught up in two places. Can you come again?
Yes, I said, yes, that's valuable information you have. The mini grids, 2.6 mini grids, you can bring them along and we can try to align them where they fall, then compare with our work we've done. And
yes.
Also I was saying that the ideal situation is to develop a load profile.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, you use the REOPT tool to do the design work, the sizing and the costing.
All right, so what I'll do is immediately, Prof, I'll share with you the coordinates because we have the coordinates pinpointing exactly where they will be deploying these mini grids. So that will be
very good, very good.
Yeah.
Very good,
Sure.
Susan. Yeah, we can share and then we bring them, our colleagues in from NREL. Thank you.
And Tim, there's a question from Sanjini in the chat. What is the preferred data resolution for country-specific analysis?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe we'll throw that one to Evan.
That's a hard question to answer. I would honestly say that we're usually limited by what data is available. I would rather have the data and sort of be able to assess on a data set by data set basis. That'd be a really hard thing just to sort of come up with a general answer to.
Maybe I'll add though, right now we're using this sort of 10 by 10 kilometer resolution as our sort of base unit, just to kind of split up countries into areas. But I think certainly the higher resolution, the better for sure. And also, just because we're using this 10 by 10 kilometer sort of base unit doesn't necessarily mean that if we get data in that resolution, it will overlap perfectly. It might be offset or something. Those cells might not line up. So yeah, it'll be challenging.
Yeah, and I mean, vector data sets, like a transmission line data set, does not have a resolution in the same sense as that a raster data set does. So that still has like a scale resolution, a sort of scale at which is meant to be precise. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I guess the best answer to that question is we prefer a resolution of data that allows us to combine it with our 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells, but it's whether or not a data set can be matched with the 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells really depends on the type of data that it is.
Yeah, this is Sadie. I would just add that I think, more kind of elaboration on the question would be helpful. Maybe Sanjini can follow up offline because, different data sets have different preferred data resolution depending on what you're most interested in. So thanks.
Checking to see if there are any other questions or comments from the group.
If not, I'll just add and just reiterate once more time. This is really just sort of the first kickoff for our regional peer learning session, which will be taking place kind of throughout all of next year. So if you're interested, or others that may be interested in this type of work or this type of analysis, please do stay tuned and loop others in, as we'll have a handful of sessions kind of as we go along, diving further and further into this this overall approach.
Great. I'm just checking the chat. Yeah, well, I think from our side as the Secretariat, just to say first and foremost, thank you to every single one of you who took time out to join us this afternoon. We know it's a very busy time and everybody's trying to wind up, but we really appreciate you being part of this discussion. And thank you so much to you, Tim, Sadie, and the rest of the NREL team, as well as Professor Yamba and Esther for their presentations. And we really, really appreciate this. Just to reiterate, we had mentioned it a couple of times, but we will be sharing the presentations, if that's okay with you, Tim, and your team. We will be packaging the presentations as well as the video from the session and sharing it to you all, but also to anybody else who may have wanted to attend, but for various reasons wasn't able to attend. And of course, there'll be more information. As Tim mentioned, this is the first in a series. We will be updating and sharing information in terms of planning as the dates for those start to crystallize and we get the further details. We will be in touch with you and keep you posted on that. Other than that, just to say thank you very much on behalf of the AFLP Secretariat. Look forward to hearing from us in the next couple of days with the packaged postcoms from this session, as well as any other details that we may want to share with you ahead of the end of the year break. But if we don't get to speak again, then wishing you all a restful end of year and look forward to seeing you again in the next sessions. Thank you very much.